All right. Hi, everyone. I am Mychal A. Bryan from the Oraculos School of Astrology, and I'm really excited. I'm always excited, but I'm definitely excited today to welcome you all to be here and to be a part of the inaugural lecture of our Medical Astrology Spring Intensive. This is something that we've had on the back burner for quite a while at the Oraculos School of Astrology. And there's never really been the right time to do this because we just have a full-on semester every single semester. And I was like, where will I possibly find the time to fit this? But we found it. And so we're here to welcome you all to either be a part of the larger medical astrology intensive that's occurring over the course of this weekend, or to just be here if you're here for the free lecture right now, just to learn more about what medical astrology is. So for those of you who don't know, I'm the founder of the Oraculos School of Astrology, and there's a long history behind how we eventually became named the Oraculos School of Astrology, because there's a lot more that we do at Oraculos than just astrology. We practice astrology, traditional Western tropical astrology, as well as other adjunct pieces of the larger Western mystery tradition. So a lot of you know about my work in terms of the Kabbalistic Tarot. Some of you know about my work in terms of geomancy. We've taught chiromancy, which is a form of astrological hand analysis, which a lot of people call palmistry. So all parts of the Western mystery tradition are things that we celebrate and things that we share and teach at Oraculos. And so I'm super happy to be able to be here and introduce you to yet another part of our Oraculos offerings. And I hope you enjoy and have a good time. So we're going to dive into our presentation. I made a slideshow, which my actual students who are in our 2-year program, they always get surprised when they see me pull out all the bells and whistles for people because I don't do any of this for them. So I made a slideshow so that we can have a little bit more organization as we dive into the topic. So the topic for today is, what is medical astrology? Now, for those of you who don't know, we are hosting our Medical Astrology Spring Intensive, which is going to run from March 11th to April 16th, 2023. And I know that many of you in here are already signed up for that. But if you aren't signed up for it already and you want to learn more about medical astrology, then that's definitely the place to do that. Even our students at Oraculos who signed up for the intensive, because this intensive is really going to be the only environment where I go as deeply into the topic as I will be going into it. You know, we have a lot to do in terms of our 2-year program, and a lot of that is really based on natal astrology, horary astrology, and predictive astrology. So pulling medical astrology out of that and specifically allowing us this space for this deep dive is something that really doesn't happen that frequently. So in the intensive, you'll learn a step-by-step method of how to actually read a natal chart from the perspective of medical astrology, which is a very important thing because the chart, as we know, is multi-prismatic. You can look at a natal chart and read it purely through the perspective of psychology and giving someone a psychological assessment of themselves. You can also look at a natal chart and read that same chart that you just read purely psychologically a moment before, purely from the perspective of vocational astrology or career astrology. You could look at a natal chart and read that same chart that you read as a vocational chart a moment before, purely from the perspective of love and romance. And similarly, you can do the same thing within the context of medical astrology. So the natal chart is this very condensed hologram of symbols and symbolic systems. And those symbolic systems are meant to tell the vast and nuanced stories of every aspect of our lives. And it's so interesting and it's so magical when you think about it, how our natal charts have the ability to be expanded in this way from what looks like a chart that just has 7 or 10 planets and 12 houses. The fact that that chart can hold our entirety is really an extraordinary thing. And so here within this medical astrology intensive, that's where you'll learn how to bring some more of that out of your chart practice. You'll also learn about the Arabic parts, parans, declination, and midpoints. Oraculos is the house that midpoints built. So if you want to learn about midpoints, and if you've always wanted to learn cosmobiology and Uranian astrology, then this is a wonderful introduction to that. And timing techniques to predict periods of decreased well-being and vitality is a huge part of the practice of the practicing seasoned medical astrologer, because we want to be able to give people an understanding of not just what the astrological conditions were when they became ill to begin with, but we also want to give people an understanding of knowing how they will progress during that period of time in which they are unwell, and how that progression will ultimately lead, or when that progression will ultimately lead to a resumed state of health and well-being. So all of these things are wonderful things that really every astrologer should know. And there's a part of me that feels a little bit, I don't know if odd is the correct word to say, but there's a part of me that always feels a little bit, I don't know, something about parsing and pulling apart these different pieces of traditional astrology, because within the context of the 17th century or the 15th century, or even as late as the 18th and the 19th century, there was no difference between the medical astrologer, the vocational astrologer, the psychological astrologer, the fertility astrologer. All of those astrologers was the same person. And I tend to teach astrology from that holistic perspective, because if you are picking up a natal chart, you should be able to do all of those things. However, in the 21st century, we tend to compartmentalize things. So for that purpose, that's why we're hosting these current medical astrology activities. So I hope that is something that you consider. So the objectives for today are, we want to explain what medical astrology is, and not just explaining what medical astrology is, but really what is the scope of practice for a medical astrologer. Within medicine in general, there's this notion of the scope of one's practice. What is the scope of your practice if you are practicing a particular type of medicine or a particular specialization within the larger medical field versus practicing something else? It's a very important thing for us to know what the scope of our practice is, and especially as astrologers who have the intention of practicing something that's so deeply political as to speak to someone about their physical health and well-being and their constitution. There's a lot of red flags that go up with that. And there's a lot of red flags that definitely go up, especially if you as an astrologer do not understand what you can and cannot do within the context of your medical astrology practice. So scope of practice is a very big thing that I'm huge on at Oraculos, and I'm going to share some of that with you as well. We'll outline what medical astrology does and why it works. We'll cover some of the basic principles of medical astrology, and we'll demonstrate medical astrology through chart examples. And unfortunately, given the time that we have, I'm not so sure that we'll be able to do that, because I do have a lot to say, but hopefully we can make something happen as we near the end. So there's a book. This book is called the Astronomica, and it's by Manilius, Marcus Manilius. Well, I'm showing you the front as if his name is on it, but it's by Manilius, Marcus Manilius. And it's really a beautiful book. And I mean, I know that there's a part of traditional astrology that's just completely saturated with nerds. And so if I tell you that a book that was written 2,000 years ago is really a beautiful book, you're like, WTF, like, is it really a beautiful book? But it's such a beautiful book, and I love it so much. It's called the Astronomica by Marcus Manilius. And in this book, it's basically a poem of astrology. And if you haven't read this yet, please do read it. I'm sure there are places online where you can find this wonderful book. But in it, one of the places that I bookmarked was this place where he talks about the frame of the human body, and he speaks about the human body from the perspective of medical astrology. Now, this book is older than 2,000 years old, and here we have Marcus Manilius showing us through his writings that this notion of medical astrology is really one that stretches far into the deepest reaches of astrological history. So here he says, now learn how the parts of the human frame are distributed among the constellations, and how the limbs are subject each to a particular authority. Over these limbs, out of all the parts of the body, the signs exercise special influences. The ram as chieftain of them all is allotted the head. The bull receives, as of his estate, the handsome neck, evenly bestowed, the arms to shoulders joined are accounted to the twins. The breast is put down to the crab. The realm of the sides and the shoulder blades are the lions. The belly comes down to the maid as her rightful lot, i.e. Virgo. The balance governs the loins, and Scorpion takes pleasure in the groin. The thighs high to the centaur. Capricorn is tyrant of both knees, whilst the pouring waterman has the lordship of the shanks, and over the feet the fishes claim jurisdiction. Wow, like who writes like that, right? Anyway, so I love that so much, but what I love more than that is this fact and this notion that we talk about medical astrology within the 21st century. And for a lot of people, medical astrology is something that's making a comeback, but it's always been a part of our astrological history. It's always been a part of how we viewed ourselves as astrologers within a larger astrological ecosystem. So the very first part in answering what medical astrology is, even before we get into the technicality, is medical astrology is fundamentally a means of plugging our individual humanity into the cosmos. And it's fundamentally a means of showing how that cosmos doesn't just organize the physical material events of our lives through our destiny and how that destiny is told within our natal chart, but medical astrology also shows us the way in which we, our physical bodies, every part of our constitution is plugged into the cosmos, and the rhythms and the cycles and the changes within our physical body are also reflected by the larger rhythms and the cycles and the changes that we find within the larger cosmic environment in which we live, breathe, and have our being. There's this notion within traditional astrology that the entire material world is created of the four elements. And those four elements are fire above, and air, which serves as a passage between the fire above and the earth below, and the water on top of the earth, and finally the earth as the final element. And the ancients thought that us as human beings, we were composed of those four elements. We were fundamentally elementata. And that word elementata specifically means elemental beings. So the ancients had this notion of us that we were elementata, elemental beings, and therefore we were just as moved by the things occurring within the earth, or we were just as moved by the forces that impacted the other elements around us, as the earth itself was moved by those same forces. According to the ancients, the planets were composed of something that was beyond the earth. The planets were composed of a fifth and a non-corruptible element, which some people have called the quintessence. And that quintessence, that fifth substance that the planets were made of, was uncorruptible. And so the ancients have told us that the planets represent this purity, or the planets are the closest we can get to understanding God and understanding the divine, because the planets show through their motions their incorruptibility. But yet through the swirling motions of the planets, they bring about corruption in our physical material world. So that swirling motion of the planets doesn't just churn around the elements of our earth. It doesn't just churn the oceans and churn the breezes, but it also has an effect on our elemental being, because anything and everything within our physical world is impacted by those superior supercelestial planets. So medical astrology begins with that sort of philosophy that we are wholly, W-H-O-L-L-Y, we are entirely created or built or born of the four corruptible elements of the hot and dry fire, the hot and moist air, the cold and wet water, and the cold and dry earth. We as human beings are fully and wholly composed of those four corruptible elements. And as a result of that, as the incorruptible governors of fate and destiny, i.e. the planets, make their movements around our earth from a geocentric perspective, then those planets also bring about different changes within our physical beings. That's something that we believe in from the perspective of astrology in general. We believe that the planets as causal factors create various things to occur within our physical lives, and the planets correspond with various events that occur within our physical lives. But there's this larger notion that the planets affect us because we are just as turned around as everything else within our Earth plane by the movement of the planets. So here on the screen, what we see is an image of what the Hindus consider to be Kala Purusha, or the body of time. And within Kabbalistic philosophy, we call this image Adam Kadmon, which means the original man. And this notion of Kala Purusha, or this notion of Adam Kadmon, is meant to denote this fact that the universe in its entirety is built in the shape of something very familiar to us. So, I mean, truthfully, from an egotistical perspective, human beings have projected these mythologies onto the universe, and we have said that, hey, there's a big man in the sky who looks just like us, and basically this is what it is. But essentially, this is meant to say that this is the shape of the universe already, and that we human beings are actually built in the shape of this original human. And that is actually very exciting. And granted, we have more scientific understanding today to know that there is no literal physical being that's built just like us standing in the center of the cosmos. But at the same time, this way how the ancients conceived the cosmos was necessary for them to feel as if they weren't just some random thing just floating around in the cosmos. And in them conceiving the cosmos as being human-shaped, they also allowed themselves to feel as if they were an intentional creation or an intentional thought within the mind of the eternal. So this Adam Kadmon that we see on the screen, or this Kala Purusha, this body of time, is meant to show how the various signs of the zodiac are corresponding with the various parts of the body of this universal archetypal human. And by extension, it's meant to show us how, on a microcosmic level, our physical bodies are also corresponding with these same processes within this larger universal body. We are the universe, and the universe is us, essentially. So what is medical astrology? Dr. William Davidson was a medical doctor who was practicing and functioning in the early 20th century. And in his medical astrology lectures, he tells us that astrology is a blueprint of the forces that flow into the body and maintain it. Now, clearly, this sounds like the astrology that's coming from someone who's specifically practicing medical astrology, because for those of us who are practicing financial astrology, we have a different concept of what astrology is. And for those of us who practice psychological astrology, we have a different concept of what astrology is. As a specifically medical astrologer who also practiced general astrology within that, he said that astrology is a blueprint of the forces that flow into the body and that maintain it. He goes on to tell us that medical astrology is part and parcel of the everyday consultation, and there are so many problems that involve the physical state. And once again, this is very true. I think that when Dr. William Davidson was giving these lectures, it was a moment when astrology was already beginning to move towards a softer psychological form. And even at that time, there are people who were very wary of that direction of astrology, because psychological astrology, it has done a lot for us in terms of giving us a context for who we are. It has done so much for us in terms of giving us a means of healing ourselves by knowing ourselves at a deeper level. But psychological astrology by itself doesn't have the range to speak about the fullness of a human being, or to speak about all of the things that impact the complexity of who we are as human beings. And so oftentimes I meet students of astrology or practicing astrologers, or they see me give a reading, and my style of astrology, as most people know, is concrete event-based astrology. Sure, let's talk about your psychology and who you are as a result of your psychological disposition, but let's also talk about the concrete events that have occurred within your life that have made you who you are. Let's talk about the concrete events that have occurred within your life that have directly contributed to the formation of your soul and psyche in the way that it's formed, as opposed to spending an hour-long reading talking about your likes and dislikes. So when we come into the space of a reading, we find that through the lens of concrete event-based astrology, everything is coming up within your chart. Who you are, your relationship to money, your relationship to your siblings, your relationship to your first sibling versus your second sibling versus your third sibling can be spoken about from your natal chart. Your siblings' relationships to their husbands and wives, your father's relationship to your mother's relationship to your siblings, your children's relationship to your partner's relationship to their siblings. All of these relationships can be spoken about purely from the perspective of reading your natal chart. And this sort of astrology is fundamentally the astrology that the entire ancient world was built on. And it isn't something that's lost. And so Dr. William Davidson is telling us that there are so many problems that involve the physical state. That same chart that has the ability to speak about your brother's relationship to his wife, as well as your daughter's relationship to her boyfriend, as well as all of these things, that same chart also has the means of speaking about your physical constitution. And it seems magical that a chart, a frozen snapshot of the sky, has the ability to do all of this. But this is something that we do at the Oraculos School of Astrology every single day. It's something that we consistently do within our astrological practice, because you should be able to have all of these proficiencies under your belt as a student and a practitioner of astrology. Because people don't just come wanting to know about their sun, moon, and rising. People come as people in their entirety with all of the things impacting their lives, and we should be able to do that level of incisive work. The question becomes, what does medical astrology specifically do? Many years ago, I had the opportunity to study with Dr. Vasant Lad, who was the Ayurvedic physician who brought Ayurveda to the West, essentially. And I had the great privilege of being able to study with him and learn from him and really spend time soaking up his vast wisdom of the human body from a more indigenous medicine perspective, because Ayurveda is that. It represents an indigenous canon of knowledge that comes out of ancient India and that still has great application and use within that medical framework today. And one of the things that Dr. Vasant Lad said that I will never, ever, ever forget is that within the context of his Ayurvedic practice, he can interpret a person's pulse by taking their pulse from their hand and come to know a great deal about that person. He read my pulse without knowing me at all. He just came up to me and read my pulse. And he said that this person is very physically active. He's probably a dancer and he loves cheese. He eats too much cheese. He needs to cut back down on his cheese consumption. I do have a professional background as a professional dancer, and I love cheese. I love cheese. Cheese for me is literally the best thing since sliced bread. I love cheese, and I also love bread as well. And Dr. Vasant Lad was able to tell that that was something that was constitutionally within me from reading my pulse. Who knows, maybe I had a slow, sluggish, cheesy pulse, but whatever. He was able to tell that by just picking up my hand and reading my pulse. And within that, he also said that if he has the ability to read the natal chart of a person or to see the natal chart of a person, it makes his job that much easier as an Ayurvedic physician in terms of assessing that person's state of well-being and health and vitality. And that blew me away. Because within the West, we don't really have a comparable model of astrology being as deeply integrated within medical assessment as is had in India. So it really sent me down a rabbit hole, and it was there at Vasant Lad's center, which at the time was in Albuquerque, New Mexico. At the moment, they're in Asheville, but at the time they were in Albuquerque. That's where I picked up this book by Dr. K.S. Charak, who's a medical doctor and a surgeon in India. This book is called The Essentials of Medical Astrology. And I'll actually stop the share so that you can see a bit closer if that's something you want to do. So this book is called The Essentials of Medical Astrology. And I don't even believe or begin to believe that I have the range to know whether or not it's an extraordinary book. There was a period of my life I studied Jyotish, which is the official name of Vedic astrology. There's a period of my life I studied Jyotish because I thought that that was just the next step. And now, years later, I realize it's not actually the next step. I realize I'm very fine in terms of practicing tropical Western astrology, and there's nothing lacking from that practice. But what I love about this book is that as a medical doctor, he lays out a manifesto of what he believes the medical astrologer should be able to do, and how he feels the medical astrologer is able to be a benefit to the larger medical field in general. And he also frankly lays out what he feels are the limitations within a medical astrologer's practice. And so that one piece is something that I would like to share with you, or his medical astrology manifesto is something that I'd like to share with you, because I think that it's so wonderful in terms of being a guidance system for those of us who would like to practice medical astrology. And I'm going to share that with you today. So the name of the doctor was Dr. K.S. Charak, Dr. K.S. Charak, and he is the head of the Department of Surgery of the Indian Spinal Injury Center in Vasant Kunj, New Delhi. Medical astrology allows us to assess the general state of constitutional vitality or weakness. It allows us to point towards systems of the body that may be most prone to illness. It helps us understand the timing factors that were present at the beginning of the illness so that we can understand when the native or the person who the chart belongs to is likely to experience periods of renewed health and vitality. So fundamentally, this is one level of the Medical Astrology Manifesto, and this isn't actually from him. This is something that I put together, because this is on the baseline what you should be able to accomplish within the practice of medical astrology. Now, as far as medical astrology is concerned, I am 1,000% of the belief that the East points the way. And by that, I'm specifically speaking about India, even though we know that in China, China has this wonderfully developed system of traditional Chinese medicine as well. And so we find more of these things occurring within the East than we even really find coming out of our own traditional Western ancestors. And the East has always had a longer time to cultivate these practices, to pour themselves into these practices, to dedicate spaces for these practices to continue to live on, whereas our Western agenda seems to have been slightly different. So the East points the way. Now, when I say this, people oftentimes get nervous because they think I'm going to take us down a Jyotish spiral where I'm going to try to start teaching Jyotish astrology, well, not Jyotish astrology, but where I'm going to try to start teaching Jyotish, or where I'm going to try to start teaching something that is really foreign to our own cultural understanding of ourselves within the West. And that isn't my point in saying this at all. My point in saying this is that when we look at traditional Indian astrology, otherwise known as Jyotish, we have a model for solid, tangible, concrete astrology. Now, there's this notion that I've heard within the West that if you want to get a reading where somebody can pick up your chart and talk to you about your sister, or talk to you about your brother, or talk to you about your brother's wife, or talk to you about your father's daughter, or whatever, you have to go to a Jyotish astrologer, or you have to go to an Indian astrologer in order for that to happen, because they're the only ones who practice that type of astrology. And in the West, we practice psychological, or we practice spiritual astrology, or we practice any of the other iterations of New Age-based astrology that have popped up over the last 20 years. So there's this divide within our astrological consciousness about who can do what, and about which schools of astrology teach us to do which things. However, you don't just go to the Geotish astrologer to find out about the concrete realities within your life, those things very much exist within the context of our Western astrological practices, and they're there waiting in full blood for us to reclaim them. However, in the process of us reclaiming them, it is a good thing for us to look at what is being done in Geotish, so that we can see whether or not we can do those same things within the context of our traditional Western astrological practice. Within the context of us looking at Geotish and learning from the Geotish astrologer, I'm not necessarily referring to the fact that we need to go and start working with the nakshatras. And I'm not referring to the fact that we need to go and start working with the dasha periods, because those things are fundamentally not a part of our traditional Western understanding of astrology. Similarly, I'm not referring to the fact that we need to go and start talking to people about their past lives. This whole notion of talking to people about their past lives from a Western astrological perspective is really not a part of our traditional lore of Western astrology. It's a wonderful and an amazing part of traditional Indian astrology, but it doesn't belong to us. So we can't look at the Indian astrologer talking about reincarnation and feel as if we could just graft that concept onto our own astrology in the West, because it has never been a part of our astrology in the West. So I think that as we look at the East for pointers for how we should be practicing, we should look at the tangible pointers. What is it they're able to do within the can we find evidence of that within our own practice? And can we say that within the context of our own practice? In his book, Dr. K.S. Charak tells us texts on ancient Indian medicine contain certain references to planetary combinations causing specific diseases. The reason why I love this quote so much is because he's pointing towards planetary combinations which cause specific diseases. One of the, don't quote me, but one of the drawbacks, and I dare say one of the limitations, and I would even go as far as to say one of the flaws that we find within medical astrology in the West today, is that it tends to lean heavily on this notion of the 12 signs of the zodiac. What I was saying about this quote from Dr. Charak is that he's speaking about how different planetary combinations cause specific diseases. In the West, we tend to focus on the signs of the zodiac and how different signs of the zodiac have the ability to be predictive of certain issues going on within a person. However, it's a very limiting place to come from. And that comes not necessarily out of Western astrology, out of traditional Western astrology. That more specifically comes out of the fact that in the early 20th century, Western astrology became very sun sign focused. And an extension of having an overly sun sign focused astrology is that all aspects of our astrology became signs of the zodiac focused. But that's only a phenomena that we find occurring within the 20th century. Previous to that, astrology has always been a planet-to-planet focused subject. Astrology has always been a far more nuanced, planetary-based, and the combinations of planets-based subject, not signs of the zodiac. So the astrologer operating now within the 21st century can't actually transplant themselves on the 17th century, talking about the sign position of your natal Venus is this, therefore, ... because this causal relationship between the sign and the planet that's in that sign, it just wasn't a thing. It's the relationship between planets as universal significators of concepts, such as Venus representing love and Mars representing fire or action or virility. Therefore, the combination of Venus and Mars is a combination that represents fertility, fecundity, or procreation. So it's that level of planet-to-planet interaction, knowing what a planet means, and therefore knowing what the combinations of planets mean, that is more the hallmark of traditional Western astrology. And we also find that being more of the hallmark of traditional medical astrology in general. Not just that your sun is in Aries, therefore you're destined to bash your head into everything within your lifetime, but what is happening between the ruler of your ascendant and other things within your chart that predispose you to bashing your head into everything within your lifetime. That was more the question that was asked by traditional astrologers. So within us reclaiming medical astrology, we're really reclaiming this understanding of how do planets interact with each other. Because if I understand how planets interact with each other as universal significators of concepts, Saturn representing blockage, the moon representing the water content of the body. Therefore, if I have a hard aspect between the moon and Saturn, it could represent there is a blockage within the movement of fluids within my body, which can result in swelling. It can result in edema. It can result in all of these things. It could result in bloating. It could result in all of these various things that prevent us from really releasing fluid or liquid content from the body. Those sorts of things are really where we want to go, as opposed to Capricorn means knees. Therefore, if I have knee problems, I must have my sun in Capricorn. He goes on to say that, true, these combinations are too general to be of any great help in medical diagnosis, but they do reveal certain principles which can be of use. Similarly, astrological texts are replete with, once again, planetary combinations, not signs of the zodiac combinations, but planetary combinations indicating specific ailments. These combinations are also fairly generalized and not easily applicable to individual charts. They can be of some utility only if the essence of their underlying principles is understood. So that's where we're starting this weekend off at. We're starting this weekend off by understanding the essence of these principles so that we can take that essence of these principles and apply them broadly across a vast number of client cases. Astrology is meant to be a complement to other concrete approaches to medicine and healing. So it's not necessarily meant to be a replacement. And I think that's also, speaking about scope of practice, we oftentimes in the West, we get very, I don't know what that, it's like it's not trigger happy, but it's another type of happy where we think that we are astrologers, therefore we're the mouthpieces of God, therefore our astrological diagnosis is more valid than an actual medical diagnosis. And that definitely isn't the case. So our astrological understanding, particularly astrology's ability to teach us about time and the movement of time, is meant to be a complement to other more concrete approaches to medicine and healing, such as traditional Chinese medicine or Ayurveda or allopathic medicine, homeopathy. The astrology is meant to complement those things and aid them as opposed to being a replacement. The relationship between astrology and medicine should be complementary and not antagonistic. And once again, this is coming from Dr. K.S. Charak. So in wrapping up this part of our presentation, here are the 4 pieces that Dr. K.S. Charak says in his Medical Astrology Manifesto that the medical astrologer should be able to perform with some level of proficiency in. He says, a medical astrologer may consider the following factors while studying a chart with respect to disease. Timing. Above anything else, timing is our mainstay as astrologers. As astrologers, we should all be masters of time. And resultantly, as astrologers, we should all be able to not only identify what various moments of time will be and what the imprint and the impact of various moments of time will be, but we should also be able to identify how that's going to actually span out over a course of time so that we can help a person orient themselves better between periods of illness and well-being. So timing is one of the factors. Diagnosis is another factor. Being able to look at a chart and being able to at least identify from looking at a chart where within a person's constitution is most likely to fall ill within the context of that person's lifetime. the severity of disease, as well as treatment. Now, as many of you know, treatment is a very big part of traditional Indian astrology, and remediation is also a very big part of traditional Indian astrology. And while that is once again built into the fabric of what that astrology looks like, we don't necessarily have the same sort of approach within the West. So what a lot of medical astrologers in the West have sought to do is to take the treatment guidelines from India and approach that within the context of our Western medical astrological model, whether that comes through gem healing, whether that comes through herbalism, whether that comes through prayer, whether that comes through feeding the planets, or whether that comes through trying to bolster the planets within our chart. We find that a lot of those techniques are really coming out of India, and they're not necessarily native to our Western approach to medical astrology, which need not necessarily be a problem. But once again, it's, the whole cultural appropriation piece, but it's also what are we doing for ourselves, and how are we fostering and creating our own set of guidelines in relationship to the astrology that we actually do have in the West, that comes more specifically through a Western lineage, as opposed to borrowing from ancient India, is the question. So moving on, insofar as the timing or the onset of disease is concerned, K.S. Charak says that this is a strong area of an astrologer, because a sound astrologer, on examining a horoscope, should be able to indicate the time when a person is liable to fall ill. Now, we all know that we can look at a horoscope and say, when this person was approximately 9 years old, there was a divorce within this person's family that tore the family apart, or that caused the family to no longer function in its original way. We know that we can look at a horoscope and say that when a person was 14 years old, this person moved, like physically moved their location, possibly to another country. And as a result of that, this person is having a difficult time really figuring out where they belong in the world. This is something that we do routinely within the context of our astrological practice. And similarly, we should also be able to know that as astrologers, timing is our strong suit. So how do we help a person with timing? One of the main ways is by studying what were the astrological factors at play at the beginning of that person falling ill. Because if we can understand the astrological factors at play at the beginning of a person falling ill, we can reverse engineer from a timing perspective a means of moving towards health and vitality once again. Or we can look forward into the future of that person's chart and see when is it most likely that that person will be healthy again. The next factor, diagnosis or the nature of disease. This is a weak area for the astrologer, says Dr. K.S. Charak, and I love the sobriety in that, because if you listen to a lot of medical astrologers today, this is something that is in spades, can be done systematically, accurately all the time, and that isn't necessarily true. So he says this is a weak area for the astrologer. To be sound in this will require a lot of research by medical practitioners proficient in astrology. Diagnosis of a disease is the strongest area of the medical practitioner, with all the sophisticated investigations at their disposal to assist in this regard. So from a medical astrology perspective, it would be remiss of us to think that we can do a better job through astrodiagnosis than a person can receive through an MRI scan. Now, at the same time, the quote-unquote diagnostic tools of a medical astrologer are such that we do know how to indicate areas within the person's constitution most likely to be susceptible to illness, or most likely to be susceptible to disease or malady. But beyond that, you could tell somebody that something's going to happen to their neck or to their throat or to their thyroid. But it requires more knowledge for us to know whether or not that's going to be Hashimoto's thyroiditis, whether or not that's going to be manifesting as a hyperactive thyroid or hyperthyroidism, hypothyroidism. There are so many things that can happen within that area of the body. So being able to identify neck is insufficient. We also have to have a nuanced understanding of some of the other things that are going on and how a hyperthyroidic problem could manifest versus a hypothyroidism problem could manifest, so that we can be able to give more nuanced advice or more nuanced assessments of things occurring within a chart than just putting the red X on the neck, basically. The severity and the outcome of disease. Generally, a medical practitioner up to date with his sound knowledge, once again, this is a direct quote from the book, will be able to accurately decipher the possible course that an ailment may take in a given patient. An astute astrologer, too, should be able to indicate the severity and the outcome of an illness with a fair amount of accuracy. As we read traditional astrology textbooks, this is one of the cornerstones of medical astrology practice. Not just that an event is going to happen, but what is the quality of that event? Is it going to be a good thing that happens? Is it going to be a bad thing that happens? And after assessing the quality of the event, what is the quantity of the event? How good will it be? How bad will it be? And this is also something that is at our disposal as just astrologers in general, which is something that we routinely do within all other aspects of astrology. We look at the second house and we start talking to a person about their financial destiny within this lifetime. And based on our skillfulness as an astrologer or as astrologers, we should be able to tell a person what the quality of their second house finances will be, whether they will in general have a good destiny as far as money is concerned, or whether or not they'll in general have a bad destiny as far as money is concerned. And this notion of being able to speak about good or bad is a quickly dying skill within astrology, because somewhere within the course of the last 20 years or so, we've been fed this story that there is no such thing as a bad combination in astrology, a story that is emphatically untrue. People have crazy things happening to them all of the time. People have great misfortunes happening to them all the time. And those misfortunes can be readily seen and predicted from within their natal charts. But in order to make that sort of prediction in the first place, we have to disabuse ourselves of this notion that there is no bad combination in the natal chart, when in fact there are emphatically bad combinations in natal charts. And that ability to be able to distinguish between good and evil, as it were, is the fundamental ability necessary to become more helpful within our skills as astrologers. You cannot help someone if you are fundamentally opposed to the notion that negative things happen within a person's life, because you would then be cutting yourself off from an entire sphere of genuine, concrete experiences that a person goes through. And if you don't even have the ability to acknowledge those experiences, then there is no way you can astrologically help that person troubleshoot a means of moving beyond those negative experiences within their lives. So the severity of a disease is also one, definitely within the scope of the medical practitioner, but it's also very much within the scope of us as professional, seasoned, proficient astrologers. Lastly, Dr. Charak speaks about the treatment of illness, and he says it is also possible that a sound astrologer may be able to point to a diseased organ or region without prior knowledge, which I previously said is something that we do quite frequently within terms of other parts of our astrological practice. It's also something that we can do with the physical body as well. And like I said, the treatment protocol or the protocol surrounding treating illness from an astrological perspective is something that is far more developed within the context of Eastern astrology, in particular Indian astrology, because India has had an unbroken astrological practice for thousands of years. Whereas in the West, our astrology has gone through many permutations, from passing hands from the Babylonians to the Egyptians to the Greeks to the Romans to the Arabs, back to the Europeans, back to us where we are today. Our astrology has gone through many permutations, and those permutations have created these lacunas or these holes within our ability to really create a comprehensive set of guidelines surrounding treatment in the same way that we have a comprehensive set of guidelines surrounding Ayurvedic treatment. But the point is, it has to start someplace. And my hope is that within the context of an intensive like this, we have the ability to begin to create some of those guidelines through our medical astrology efforts. This is the Medical Astrology Manifesto. And not only is this the Medical Astrology Manifesto, this is really meant to give us a taste of what is possible within the context of our practice as those of us who call ourselves astrologers. What else can we bring into our practice to make ourselves not just astrologers from the perspective of being able to talk to someone about their sun, moon, and their rising sign, but what else can we do that actually not only gives the field of astrology a greater amount of credibility and a greater amount of muscularity so that people can really respect what we do in a robust way because they see the physical material evidence of what we do? And how can we align ourselves with practices that allow our astrological practice to become more complete? And if we are striving to be more complete within the context of our astrological practice, then there is no way that the body-mind unit or the body-mind complex of a person can be ignored. And to that end, medical astrology must also be one of the cornerstones of our own evolving astrological practice. To end, here is a final quote, and this quote says that there are many challenges and opportunities for research. The known basic principles of classical astrology have to be extended into the unknown areas of medical science. And it is my intention and it is my goal to accomplish that within the context of this 6-week-long medical astrology intensive. But thank you all so much for being here. And if you have any questions or queries or concerns, please feel free to shoot us an email at hello@oraculosastrology.com or visit our website at oraculosastrology.com. And like I said, if any of you want to stick around and join the actual medical astrology intensive that's occurring today, you are very much welcome to stick around and be a part of that. If you can stick around right now, but you want to come back later, there are recordings of the intensive that's going to be posted to our Thinkific. So if you can stick around today, but you want to come tomorrow, then by all means, please let me know as well, because you are definitely welcome here and you definitely have a seat at the table of our medical astrology intensive.